Hi, I'm Tony Williams, and this is Brooklyn Savvy. Hi, I'm Tony Williams, and this is Brooklyn Savvy. We are here at the fabulous 118 Amity, and we're not talking horror. We're talking 118 Amity here in Cobble Hill. But anyway, what we're really here to discuss is this totally engrossing and fascinating book that has been written by Annette Vendryes Leach. You know, Annette, I've read the book twice, and Brooklyn, you will soon find out what the book is. It's Song of the Shaman. But it's a story about reincarnation, which I find extremely intriguing. And then I had the privilege of seeing you on Lifetime, and it was the ghost within my child. So I thought when I first read Song of the Shaman that this was just pure fiction, that you just had this incredible imagination. I didn't know that it was woven into your life in many respects with your son. So if you could just tell us about the book, and then we'd like to hear about how it was informed by or inspired by the journey that your son took in terms of his believing that he had a past life.
I'll give you my elevator pitch. Song of the Shaman. It's the story of a single mother's spiritual awakening through the mystical guidance of her 10-year-old son. And the book was inspired by my sons. I have two boys. And what was fascinating to me was that they both told me very similar things when they were about 3 years old. And this scene is actually in the book. I was giving him a bath and I was expecting my second child. And we were talking about the day, and he just started telling me that he remembered me from before he was born.
And you said at 3.
He was
That's
3 years old.
interesting, right?
And I asked him, I said, well, you know, what do you mean? He says, well, I chose you, that's how I know.
I think in the book you said, I
He
saw
says,
you when I was in heaven.
Yeah, said I chose you to be my mom because I saw you before I was born, when I was in heaven. And I remember looking at him and saying, well, you remember when you were in heaven? And he says, yeah. He says, yeah, I remember. He says, I could see everything. He says, you could see through everyone and everything. And that I chose you to be my mom, but I had to wait. And
then he spoke about having to jump.
Yes.
You know, jump into a body. How's that?
Yeah, he used to jump down on well, one told me my younger son later on, when he was 3 years old, said he also had to jump and slide down on a string. And which, you know, after I started reading about past lives and string theories and DNA, that it is all plausible that we're connected through this matrix. So it made sense then.
Very first moment, what did you think? You wondered, like, what film he had seen that day
Yes.
in preschool.
I did, and I asked him that too. I said, well, you know, what did the babysitter read you
But there was
today?
more to it than that, though, because he was able to identify artifacts later on, like the arrowhead that he identified on the beach, if you want to share a little of that.
Sure. My younger son actually told me that even though he chose me to be his mother, I wasn't always his mother. He had another mother before me.
Were you jealous?
I asked him, I said, well, then, you know, what do you mean by that? And he says, well, you weren't my mother. And I said, well, who was I? And he never answered. He just kind of looked. So I always wondered, but he still has never told me what I meant to him. But he said that he had a whole other family, and they were Indians. And he said that his brother was always his brother, and that they had to go on what I now understand to be a vision quest. He was sent out of his village into the forest to search for an animal. And he told me the story over and over and over again. He was about 3. And I remember thinking, like, you know, where could he be getting this from? And I checked the shows he was watching and the books he was reading, and you know, he was going to a school that didn't have any religious affiliations at the time. And I was like, well, you know, how could this be? and what does it mean? If I pressed him too much, he would stop talking about it. If I asked him too many questions. So I usually, he would very spontaneously start this dialogue with me. And I would just have to stand very still and listen to him. Otherwise, he would stop and
did
change.
they dialogue with one another about their experiences, or just to you?
That's a great question. No, they did not talk about it together. I would say to one, do you know your brother said this? And then they would ask me, it's like, when did he tell you this? And what else did he say? But they never talked about it to each other. And not when they were little. Now they do.
So how did they convince you or of this, of their past lives, or did you need convincing?
In the beginning, I needed convincing because I thought, okay, this is just a fantasy.
Weren't wondering what drugs you did
yeah.
while you were pregnant.
Hey, but then,
What did I take? Right.
but they got very specific, and then it never varied. Like he would say the same things over and over again. And usually kids will vary things or they'll forget. But he told me he had to
my
get
story,
his,
and I'm sticking to it.
Yeah, and it stayed, and little things would remind him of the story, and then he would retell it to me. And then I just started to look things up on my own, and found out there really was such a thing as a vision quest. He didn't use the word vision quest at the time, but I was putting the facts together to find that there were certain rituals that were exactly the same as what he was saying to me. And
he had no way of knowing that,
No,
except
no.
coming from him. Yeah.
As three?
But no, she's talking. She went further on. She was going further. How now your sons have these past lives, not something that you hear every day. They're going out into the world. Were you one to say keep these stories within the home, or
To protect them.
Yeah, right. Or did they share it beyond the family? Or actually, even within the family. Did they tell your mother?
So they kept it to themselves because I remember my husband came home and I told him after they went to bed, I said, guess what August said to me today? And I told him, and he was fascinated too, but one of the first things he says is, we shouldn't tell anybody about this. Because, I don't know if everyone will be as open and understanding, and will just wonder, like, where is he getting this from?
How did they feel when you wrote the book? How did they feel about
Yeah,
that? Family as source material, even though it's a fictionalized.
Annette, now it's out here. The story's out here.
Right.
Brooklyn, the story is out now.
In order for me to understand and process it, and it took many, many, many years of me thinking about this and thinking about his stories. And then one day I told him when he was in high school, I said, I'm writing this book, and I just want you to know that I'm using some of the things that you told me. And he looked at me and said, well, if you want to tell the story, it's okay, but I don't know if everyone will understand it. And I said, it's okay because I'm not writing it for everybody to understand. I'm writing it for me to understand.
Right.
And he said, okay.
Have they had, since writing the book and since coming out with the stories, have they had any interaction or any kind of reactions from the book after it was publicized?
A lot of friends and family, and they see my reviews on Amazon, and my younger son says, well, I'm the star of the story now. Now he's like it's a little celebrity for me, But
Let me give you my autograph now, right? Yeah.
I think they also held their breath a little bit once it was published and in the stores. I'm like, okay, let's see what's going to come out of this. But I think it was very important for them to see me finish this.
It was how much did you share with them through the process?
I didn't share much at all, other than just talking about it. I didn't let them read any of it.
And now, if I've got questions about some of the characters. For instance, Sherry, who is the mother. Is there anything in her journey that coincided on some level with what you were feeling?
Yes, there's two parts to this story. One was my boys telling me about their past lives, and the other was about my grandmother, who I found out very late in life was adopted. And it was around the same time that my boys started to tell me their past life stories. And my mother decided that she wanted to try to find her mother's family. They never talked about it. My grandmother never talked about it. She was a very quiet woman, and now I understand why. She always had this kind of faraway look in her eyes. My mother never talked about it either. But then one day I was packing to go to Mexico, and she came over to me with this little piece of paper with a name on it and said, "When you get there, would you look up this name?" And I said, "Well, who is this?" And she says, "I think that this is your grandmother's father's name." And I said, why would I be looking up this name? And then that's what she told me, that she was adopted, and she just recently figured out what the name might have been. So then it started to explain a lot of things to me, because if my mom didn't know her own mother's family, I don't know my family either. There's a part of me that's also lost. So as a tribute to my grandmother, I wanted to try to find, I went into this genealogical search, and I found that the name did come from the rainforest region between Panama and Costa Rica. So I started to put a lot of 2 and 2s together to see, there are a lot of indigenous groups there. And then it gelled a little bit with the story that my son was telling me about his Indian past life. So I couldn't get very far with my search. It was very difficult to get information. She was born in 1901. And so when my research hit a wall there, I decided that the book had to then go into fantasy. I had to create a story for her.
And you did such a marvelous job at that fantasy. But one of the things that Nomiki and I had been speaking about was there was also this wealth of social issues within the book. First of all, your main character, Sherry, was a single mother. And in fact, share with our audience who this character was. She's an executive, she's decided to have a baby.
Sherry Lambert was adopted from an orphanage in Panama. And she was raised here in New York City by a Jewish family. She wasn't raised with any sense of spiritual belief system. She was raised to be a successful businesswoman, despite the fact that she also had artistic abilities. She was pushed into a business world, and as such, most women today that are on a career track sometimes put their personal life to the side. And she woke up one day, 35 years old, unmarried, no real prospects, and the biological clock was ticking.
And she heeded to the call.
She
was a brave soul, I must say, because wow, that was a lot to take on. Yeah.
She figured, I'm doing well, and she wanted more than anything to start a bloodline of her own, because she was adopted, and she also was unable to find any blood relatives, and felt at that point in her life that the only thing she could do that would try to make herself feel whole would be to have her own child. So she gives birth to her son Zig, but before you know it,
he was a serious handful.
He was a handful.
Yeah, he had so many. And the other piece that really, just trying to get Zig to fit in, because the way that she managed that he was managing his past life story, he was telling the world about it. He was sharing it with his friends at school. It was so thoughtful on that level, because any mother could identify with some of the choices that she was making, but it was such a tension around keeping him there to the point that they wanted to medicate him And then it brought to my mind, it's like, well, gee whiz, if your child's not fitting in, what, do you have to medicate him so that he does fit in? Or do you find another environment for the child? So it was all those other layers and dimensions to your work that I found so interesting.
Astronomical number of kids are on medication, and that this is the right now.
Well, you read
the
that
highest-
article about ADHD.
Yeah,
that's
exactly.
interesting.
Performance enhancing
So that's
drugs.
becoming the norm.
Well,
Like, that
just
there's
saying
this
actually
industry-
they're bored.
Yeah.
They don't actually need medication.
They're just bored,
They're
bored
just
kids.
bored.
academic
Yeah.
environment
Right,
has more
right.
stimulation.
And Zig has that same issue, exactly the same in the book. He's bored. They want to medicate him because he's starting to bring some of his wild ideas into the classroom, and
Causing girls to faint. It's
yeah,
like, really? I
they
did
have
not like that tie-in. It's like, oh, she fainted. Oh, and he's being blamed for it. Oh, I understood that piece, the blaming, But anyway,
they
yeah.
had to, the school, they have to try to get through their day.
Now, Annette, what are your religious beliefs?
I was raised Catholic. I'm a Christian, and went through all the sacraments, and I love the pageantry of the Catholic Church. But as I got older, I always questioned things, and it always seemed to me that the Catholic Church was outside of myself. It was always something that I admired, but I never felt the
Connected, the
I
connection?
never felt any connection to God other than the beautiful statues and the stained glass and just the holidays, the seasons would always evoke a feeling of warmth. But I felt like there has to be something more to this. And I've read a lot of other kinds of books. I was greatly influenced by Paramahansa Yogananda's books, Autobiography of a Yogi specifically. And I learned a great deal about Eastern religions that way, which also talk about reincarnation. But there are so much.
Catholicism really doesn't deal with reincarnation per se, except for the eternal soul. But you share with us past life experience, your experience, no, Mickey. It's kind of interesting.
Yeah, it was an informal experience, but someone at one point in time, I had gone to a spa for a massage, and she was in past life readings herself. She studied them, and she told me she could read me very easily, and she, brought out some of the things that I found interesting, because I had never met this woman, and she said to me that, I worked with people and in my past life, and that I died for these people in fighting for them, in helping them, in advocating for them. And lo and
But
behold,
you don't have a memory of that, though,
I don't
right?
have a memory of that.
Which is different from your kids who had memories of
Well,
it.
this was
Yeah.
as an adult, so
Right.
When in the book, your children were younger when they had the recollection. But I thought that was very interesting, because in my present life, or my life, I'm a psychologist, and I do heal, and I do help, and I do advocate for people. And she said to me, you lose a part of yourself, a part of you dies every day. And if I were to equate that to the work that I do, it's a part of our soul giving a sense of ourself as a clinician to your clients or to your patients so that they can heal. It's your lending self, as we call it clinically. And so for me, I found that fascinating, because she didn't know me, and what she said carried a little validity to it for me. And it fascinates me that this is something that it always got me wondering, and I do want to explore. And the book really brought that out for me again, that I said, I need to go for a past life reading, but I found it fascinating.
But
and
who would one trust
I
with? Because there, since it did it
Right.
feel
It
right
wasn't-
to you, or
Well, it
did
wasn't
you,
solicited.
Right,
so
that's a good sign.
I thought
Right,
that was
yeah,
interesting,
right.
and there were so many very close connections. I found it amazing. I mean, this was a person who didn't know me at all. I never interacted with her.
Pretty though. I
thought
guess
it was
I feel like
interesting.
that's a pretty, that's like red or black. You 50% shot in a past life, you could have helped someone. I don't know. I'm not being a skeptic here, but
No, but I hear you.
you know.
Yeah. which is different, you know, because it's always, but you know, it has to do with how does it resonate in your soul? What did it
Right,
make you
right,
feel?
right.
Was there something in the pit of your gut that said, hey, I think there might be some truth to this? Or
In the moment,
'Cause there are quacks, you know, there's all kinds
I
of
was
stuff in there.
fascinated. In the moment, I really felt a connection, you know, like you're saying, Ellen, and I understand it could be, you know, that could be a generic statement. But in this particular case, it really did. And I did feel that connection, and it made me want to seek out more. And since she said I was so easy to read, I said, well, then.
did your sons ever do any kind
Yeah.
of past life regression or anything like that? You know, aura readings or that kind of new age stuff that they didn't need to, right? They didn't. It was just in them.
They just, I think when you're, you know,
Their veil
up
was
to
lifted.
up till 3, yeah, I think
Yeah.
as they got older, you become more invested in this world and you become more invested in your ego. But when you're very young, you're still quite
It's interesting that you
pure.
mentioned 3 because I remember at 3, you know, and again, I don't know whether it was the TV I was listening to, but I remember just kind of waking up and saying, I'm back so soon. I remember that. Back so soon? I don't know.
See?
Because I
And you
didn't
didn't
remember the
even
trip
know.
down on the street.
Yeah, but you
know,
remember
but
the
I remember
sense
the
of
feeling
being back
so soon. That was like the first thing that came to my mind. And then it was like I could remember things. I was awake. It was like I had like a real, you know, the eggshell cracked open and there I was. I do remember saying that. And I have a kind of image of who I was. But then there's a piece of me because I am, you know, so religious, you know, but no, this is all spiritual. I'm also very spiritual, so I can embrace it, you know. But I think I even know, I was telling you guys, I think I was a little blonde hair, strawberry blonde. Seriously, I was a little preppy boy. It was really cute. But that's in my head.
Name like Winthrop.
Something like that. I had leggings and a nice little jacket. And then, you know, in a car accident. No, but you know what? It's so funny because I always think of somebody going to ram me in the back. Maybe all of us think that way when they drive. But I'm always, you know.
But there's
Yeah, I was just a little privileged fellow. And it was like back so soon. And here it is. Well, you know, we have lessons to learn.
there's little splinters.
Do you feel like your sons have a consciousness now that they're adults? Are they kind of using their past life experience as they try and progress in this life? I mean,
I try to
That's an
remind them.
interesting
I ask
question,
them.
yeah.
I ask them, you know, from time to time. Do you remember what you said to me? And so they get a little strange look on their face sometimes, and
Oh,
it's
don't
like,
bring us here again, Mom.
you know, yes.
Yeah.
One of my older one, he would say, you know, like it made him feel uncomfortable to remember it because it must be that you're pulling back, you're going back into another time, and that you're in this time, and
You gotta live the life
and
you're
you
in
want to,
now.
yes.
It's a
zeitgeist. Now, you know, the book is relatively recently published, and I think that there's a zeitgeist now with all these paranormal shows on television.
It's all over the place,
And I mean,
isn't
like,
it?
so you tapped
Right.
into something early, and so I'm curious, like, what's the next book?
Yeah. The next book, I'm working on another one now because a lot of people have asked me, well, what happens to her after she understands and comes to a realization? And I think that's, you know, I'm using part of my own life experience to try to understand how we know what the spirit world is. Because we are spiritual beings first, having a human experience. But it's one thing to say that, and another thing to actually know it. Because
You said that in the book, and I really, you know, that was to me was profound because it's truth. You know, that's how I see life. Not everybody may see it that way, but I agree with you that we're spiritual beings in a body.
Yes.
And the body expires. You know, it has an end date. You know, whereas the soul does not, or the spirit does not.
It doesn't, and it's evidenced through my sons remembering their past life. It's like, well, how is it possible that you could remember something a whole nother time, being a whole nother person, yet you're standing here and you're a little boy from Brooklyn? It's like, well, how does that work? What does that mean?
You know, in the whole show, Ghost Within My Child, there are a lot of kids out there with these kinds of stories. This past week, there was a little girl who had been burned in a fire. And, you know, a lot of these kids, apparently, that is part of why they may have some sort of anxiety disorder because of something that they experienced in a past life. Yeah. So it's like, this is all new, right? Come on now. This is really new. Come on.
Yeah.
It's all fascinating. It's all fascinating.
It's like, why is it that they remember the pain and the terror, the death?
Right, all the bad stuff.
It's the bad stuff that's the suffering stays with you, and that you can remember from life because it's so traumatic.
But is that needs to be healed as you evolve? Is that the part that needs the healing?
Yes, and the thing is that you're already healed because you're here and nothing happened to you. So it's something that is outside of time. It has to do with time.
Oh, it's clearly outside of time.
It's the one that's outside of time that knows these stories, and maybe they even have seen themselves die, but they couldn't die. And that's the whole story of
But the reason we think we have time is the reason there is a time is because of the body.
Yes.
Otherwise, it would be no time.
That's it.
Right.
There is no time. It doesn't exist. So that was what I was trying to understand.
That hit me hard one day. And I said, wow, there is no time. We just believe there's time, but there isn't any. Isn't that something, Brooklyn?
I know. It's very interesting how, when you think about it, everything takes time. Then at the end, time takes everything from you.
Time is measured, right? You know.
So then the question is, what does not take any time?
You know, unfortunately, that's all the time we have. Brooklyn Savvy, but it was fascinating. And this book, Song of the Shaman by Annette Leach, is just fascinating and interesting. For it to be fiction, it's so authentic. Your voice really, really shines through. So thank you so much for being on this episode and sharing your story. It's inspirational. You should be very proud of yourself. Thank you. Well, that's all the time we have for this episode of Brooklyn Savvy. We will see you next time on Brooklyn Savvy.